I want to tell you about an abandoned house I know. It's in a very remote part of the country, just standing there on its own in an otherwise deserted and godforsaken area. Well, I haven't been there for years now. But every time I had been there in an earlier life, I wouldn't notice any trace of it being inhabited or used otherwise. Now, how on earth should anyone choose to live there? In good weather, a four-wheel drive car can take you to a point as close as a 4 hours hike away from it. The single-track road that takes you there is narrow and bumpy for miles on end. Since nobody ever uses it, scattered pieces of rock and heavy branches stand in the way. After struggling for an hour or so dealing with all sorts of obstacles, I'd always wonder if some higher being wanted to make sure that no one could ever pass. And if so, I said to myself, I'd better be prepared for further, maybe even harsher proofs, that no one's welcome in these parts. But sure, you wanna know why the hell I'm talking about this rotten house, and the cursed route leading there in the first place. And you bet, it's not easy to say even for myself. Have you ever felt that sinister urge to visit a particular place? This vague suspicion that there was sort of an association between you and this location? That it played a mysterious, but very personal role in your life, which maybe you had only forgotten. If so, then you might understand what I was at. In fact, I haven't been there for more than 10 years now. But all the time there was this strange and somewhat scary desire to stand in front of that building once again. Just to be there, no idea what for, or what else I should do then. And now that I don't work anymore, I have plenty of time. And this, I reckon, is the moment to make for the road. I packed my rucksack with all things necessary to spend a few days and nights out in the wild. I stuffed my pop-up tent and sleeping bag into the trunk. I took some grub, and plenty of water too. And one morning late in spring, I left home with a full tank and 2 extra canisters of fuel. After like 2 hours, I left the main road, and followed an unpaved track, leading further on, into that uninhabited hinterland. I engaged 4-wheel drive, and slowed down. I figure this path was last used during the war, and later for some time by loggers, after the whole region had been turned into a wildlife preservation area back in the 50s. It has since become useless. I knew that it ended in a far distance, somewhere out in the boonies, and that therefore not even hikers or huntsmen would ever follow it. No doubt, this trail was the perfect paradigm of the proverbial route to nowhere. Another hour had passed, when the trail became really difficult. Fallen trees barred my way, and it required quite some effort, either to drag them aside, or to find a bypass. I now was in a mountainous and very densely forested region, and the track was the only sign reminding me that other humans had been here before. But here we are at last. Suddenly the dense forest opened into a wide basin, lined by gruff rock massifs. And literally in the center of this extensive glade, I recognized the solitary house again. After like 10 more minutes I stood in front of it, and a strange feeling seized me, as if I had accomplished a mission. After the long hike, I was kind of exhausted, so I first sat down on a wooden bench that cuddled up against one of the walls. Later I pitched my tent on a grassy spot nearby, and made myself a cup of coffee on my camping stove. After brooding a while, asking myself what I should do next, I got up for a closer inspection. I walked around the building and took some pictures. The house seemed bigger than I had remembered it, but its features looked exactly the same as I had encountered them last time some 10 years ago. Back then, its entrance door had always been firmly locked, so I didn't expect it to be open now. And trust me, I was rather surprised to find it accessible this time. Although I'm not the sort of pal who breaks into other people's homes, I couldn't resist to take a look inside. And what I saw there, in the light of my torch, gave me the creeps. Not immediately though, cause at first, nothing seemed to make sense. A large table with a bench and several chairs around it almost filled what obviously was the living room of the house. In a cupboard I found bottles, the content of which seemed to have evaporated during the many decades, perhaps even centuries, since they had been in use. One brown glass container was filled with a yellow powder, the smell of which left no doubt that it had to be sulfur. On others, tiny labels marked that they contain white phosphorus and other chemicals. On a wooden beam, running lengthwise along one of the walls, two framed charcoal drawings stood side by side, covered with a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. On the surface of a smaller table, there were rows of oblong wooden boards, riddled with tiny parallel notches. In a corner, I found several tin basins. In an open dresser lay heaps of heavy old cotton rags. Since at first, I couldn't make any sense of these paraphernalia, I took a closer look at the two drawings. And what I realized came as a shock. On one of them, I saw a young man in shabby garments, reminding me of the clothing style of a bygone century. To me, he looked like a street vendor or peddler, offering an unidentifiable merchandise of a kind. And I couldn't help thinking that his looks resembled mine. Yes, sure, no doubt about it. On the rear side of the framed drawing, someone had marked a reference in a dainty handwriting, "Mark, our beloved firstborn." I scrutinized the second picture. It showed 6 individuals, obviously a family of 6. Their clothes seemed to belong to the same period as those of the other guy, and seemingly they represented their Sunday best, though worn out and shabby, as in the other depiction. I reckoned that the young man on picture 1 might be the eldest son of the family. Maybe he had to sell elsewhere what the rest of the family had produced in their faraway home. And while illuminating both images with my torch, it suddenly dawned on me what merchandise the peddler's son had in store. I had read about the topic in a historical magazine couple of years ago, charcloth and brimstone matches. And immediately I knew what purpose all the peculiar bits and pieces in this room had served. Indeed, sometime in the early 19th century. In this house a poor family must have made their living by crafting spunks and cotton tinder for fire making. I couldn't hold against you, if you never had heard of such kind of contraptions so far. So let me explain to you what it was about. The first forerunners of matchsticks, as we know them today, weren't around till the late 1820s. Believe me, starting a flame, and were it only to light a candle, was kind of a job in the times before. As a longtime wild camper and bush crafter, I am quite familiar with the procedure, and whenever I get out in the wild, I always have the basic materials in my rucksack to start a fire, the way they did it in the olden days. Let me show you how it was done back then. All you needed was some char cloth in a tinder box, a flintstone, and an iron fire striker. And if you didn't want to start a whole fire, but for instance only wanted to ignite a candle at night, you also had to have some brimstone matchsticks ready, or spunks, as they also called them. Now, brimstone matches can't be started by striking them on a rough surface, as is the case with the strike anywhere matches, that were invented around 1826 by an English apothecary. What you did to get a flame was striking the sharp edge of a flint stone against the iron, until a spark made a glow point on the char cloth. You then had to blow on this glowing spot to make it bigger, and now you'd hold the sulphurous tip of a brimstone match into the embers to ignite it. And bingo, that was it. With the burning stick you now could light up your candle, and at night find your way to the outhouse. Quite some drudgery, compared to simply striking a match, I should say. But that's the way they did it. And of course, somebody somewhere had to manufacture both charcloth and brimstone matches back then. Now, dealing with liquefied sulfur and roasting linen rags in a fire was a rather dirty and unrewarding sort of job. It was mostly done by poor folks in long and badly paid factory shifts. But there were also independent families, who made their modest living on this trade at home. Manufacturing brimstone matches was a relatively simple procedure. All you had to do was getting thin wooden sticks ready, and dip them in a bowl which contained heated and thereby liquefied sulfur powder. And thus, I came to realize what kind of business had kept the former inhabitants of this house alive. The income was poor, and a harsh life it must have been. But over the years, things changed in the world of matchsticks, and the life of our family became even harsher. Beginning around 1830, the self-igniting strike everywhere match with a phosphorus tip drove away the complicated toiling with flintstone, tinder and brimstone sticks. Within just a handful of years or two, the brimstone match was out of the trade for good. Of course, our family folks had to jump on the bandwagon too, simply because otherwise they would have been doomed to starvation. But doomed they were even so. Well then, almost from one day to the next the Brahmin family gave up brimstones, and switched to producing first-generation self-igniting matches, phosphorus-tipped ones that is. But manufacturing phosphorus matches was much more intricate than with their brimstone predecessors. Now the dipping frames, wooden plates with small notches, came into play. Nimble fingers, mostly those of children, stuck ready-cut sticks one by one into the notches of the oblong boards, as I had seen them on the table. A skilled kid could manage up to 90,000 sticks in a 10-hour workday. Then the lathes with the inserted matchsticks were clamped into a frame and dipped in tin basins, filled with a viscous mass containing a high proportion of heated phosphorus. After a period in the drying room, the matches were removed from the holding frames and neatly packed, first in oval boxes made from wood shavings, later in matchboxes, as we know them till this day. Taking the two pictures with me, I stood up, left the room and went out of the house. I slowly walked around it once again, envisioning how, and 200 years ago, both parents and a handful of children had toiled away in there. Despite 12 to 14 hour shifts 7 days a week, the revenue of making phosphorus matches was poor, and hardly sufficed to grant a family's barest necessities. In order to somehow make a living on this trade at all, every hand was needed, those of small children included. Pine spills had to be cut in large numbers. I envisioned how skillful little hands stuck them into the notches of the dipping frames. I figured how the father dipped them into the basins, filled with the hazardous pulp of yellow phosphorus, glue, chalk powder and saltpeter. Disastrous diseases were common back then, caused by the ongoing exposition to phosphorus fumes. Phossy jaw was a dreadful necrotic affection of the lower jaw, horribly painful, and gruesomely disfiguring the faces of the persons affected. Many of those working in the matchstick industry died an early death. I had to look at the family picture once again, and I shuddered over the naively innocent looks on the pale faces of the 4 children. Sure, you wonder how a poor family with such a meager income could afford to live in a rather stately house like this. Of course I had asked myself the same question before. Well, I presume that their ancestors had been farmers. Today, as well as 200 years ago, the whole ground of this glade is rocky, apart from a few swampy areas or grassy patches. But it is historically proven that sometime in the late 1700s, a violent thunderstorm has caused a rocky avalanche, which barred the outlet of this basin. As a result, a lake was built, which for a number of years covered the whole bottom of the glade. In the oncoming decades, gradually the lake dried out, and instead of arable farmland, a rock-covered bottom remained. So that our family of farmers had to make a hard choice, either to move elsewhere, or to find new means to make a living. And obviously they chose the latter, probably above all else because they couldn't afford a new home somewhere away from here. I guess that with the death of the last member of those 2 generations, as depicted on the drawings, this family was extinct, and life ceased to exist in their home. Phosphorus fumes not only led to phossy jaw and an early death, they also caused frequent miscarriages. Pondering over this family's destiny as matchstick makers, I had completely forgotten what had shocked me the moment when I first saw the drawing of their eldest son, that he resembled me in a rather uncanny way. Now, I'm not one who believes in reincarnation. I definitely can't figure to have been a matchstick peddler in an earlier life. But there wasn't only this striking resemblance, but also this peculiar alluring attraction I had felt all the years since I had stood in front of this house for the very first time. How should I make sense of it all? I've racked my brains over this question ever since, but I came to no conclusion whatsoever. Maybe the young guy's resemblance on the portrait was pure coincidence? And yes, I had a peculiar interest for ruins and abandoned houses since I can remember. Or maybe it had something to do with there are more things between heaven and earth? I don't know, and meanwhile I don't care about it either. Anyhow, my little story is nearing its end. And you wonder what message it carries? Well, I leave that up to you. But I guess that many of those poor folks, who had to slave away and to suffer so horribly back then, no, I don't believe that most of them were decisively unhappier, as not a little of us today who, disregarding to be much better off, are always discontent with their lives. Such is human life, as I'm tempted to say, too many people are notoriously unhappy, notwithstanding their actual circumstances. Which always puts me in a pensive mood, whenever I come to think of it. Particularly in these our days, as doubts arise if the human project will make it any longer at all. I'm an old man now, and I don't think that I yet shall have to witness the end of mankind. If we're all doomed, so be it. I wouldn't be able to prevent it either. But till I die, I wish I could keep my deeply rooted thankfulness for having had such a goddamn good life. And that's it. This is all I have to say about the matter. Enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for listening. Hang on in there and so long you guys.